The desert was still when he came riding through, a bruised streak of dawn spreading low over the horizon, the kind of pale, colorless light that made every shadow seem alive. The wind had teeth, dragging thin veils of dust across the land, whispering through brittle sage. His horse stumbled beneath him, foam at its mouth, its flanks dark with sweat. Eli Tanner had not meant to cross this far south, not into Apache lands. But the men behind him, white marauders with whiskey on their breath and nothing left to lose, had forced his hand. He'd been riding 3 nights without rest, hunted like a coyote. When the first arrow of sunrise struck the rocks, he knew the animal couldn't go another mile. The horse collapsed near a cluster of mesquite trees. Eli hit the ground hard, tasting iron. His hands shook as he tried to pull himself up, but his right leg bent wrong beneath him, a break or a deep bruise, he couldn't tell. The world tilted, the air thick with dust. Through the blur, he saw the faint smoke of campfires beyond the ridge, a village, quiet and self-contained, the scent of cooking meat drifting on the wind. He tried to call out, but what left his mouth was barely a sound. The last thing he remembered was the gleam of sunlight on bronze and the hollow thud of feet running toward him. Then the blackness took him. When Eli woke, the world had changed. He lay flat on his back inside a circular hut of woven reed and hide. The air smelled of smoke, herbs, and animal fat. His wounds burned. Someone had stripped his coat and shirt away, cleaned the blood crusted to his ribs, bound his leg in a firm splint. A thin shadow moved across the tent wall, someone tending a fire just beyond. Then voices, low, sharp, rhythmic, words he didn't understand. The flap of the lodge opened and light spilled in. 5 men entered, silent and watchful, boughs slung over their shoulders. Behind them came a tall man with gray-streaked hair bound in 2 braids, his expression carved in patience and stone. His eyes found Eli's, calm but unyielding. The others spoke quickly, gesturing toward the wounded cowboy, toward the hills beyond, toward the rifle that lay broken beside him. The gray-haired man listened. When he finally spoke, it was with the certainty of someone long accustomed to command. Eli didn't need translation. He knew judgment when he heard it. He tried to speak, to explain that he wasn't one of the raiders, that he'd fought them too, that they'd turned on him. But his throat was dry as sand. The only sound that came out was a rasped apology, the word sorry, repeated like a prayer. One of the younger warriors spat on the ground. The older men nodded grimly. Eli could see it in their eyes. They thought he was lying, that he was one more settler scout, a snake in borrowed skin. The tall man, the chief, Eli guessed, stepped closer. He crouched, eyes narrowing at the scars on Eli's wrists, the torn flesh on his shoulder. The chief said something quietly. 2 men lifted Eli upright. He cried out, pain shooting through his leg. They dragged him from the hut into daylight. Outside, the settlement stretched across a shallow basin ringed by red cliffs. Smoke rose from small cooking fires. Children stared from doorways. Women froze mid-task, hands still on their baskets. Every face turned toward the wounded outsider. Eli's heart pounded. He could feel their anger like heat from a forge, a whole people, silent but united in suspicion. They brought him before the chief's lodge, where elders sat in a semicircle. A woman in her 50s muttered harshly, pointing toward the horizon. Another man lifted a stone knife from his belt and drove its point into the dirt between them, the gesture clear as words. This man dies here. The air thickened. Someone began to chant low and steady, a rhythm like the slow beat of wings. And then she appeared. She came from behind the chief's lodge, a woman wrapped in a pale shawl, the kind dyed with crushed herbs and sun. Her hair was long and dark, braided with small bone beads that clicked softly as she moved. Her expression held no fear, only calm purpose. When she reached the circle, the chanting stopped. She stood beside her father, Chief Nietzsche, and spoke in a voice soft but unbreakable. Eli couldn't understand her words, but the tone pierced through him, measured, patient, almost pleading. The chief's eyes flickered. The elders protested. One slammed his palm against his knee in refusal. But she did not waver. She took one step forward. gestured toward the broken man in the dust, and said something that stilled the air. Whatever she spoke carried weight beyond her years. The chief's expression hardened, then eased. He turned his gaze on Eli, studying him for a long moment. Finally, he gave a single nod. The men released their grip. Eli slumped to the ground, gasping, the taste of earth in his mouth. He lifted his head just enough to see her watching him, not with pity, but with something quieter. Curiosity, maybe. Defiance. She said a few more words to the men beside her, and they reluctantly hoisted him up again. This time they didn't drag him toward the river or the cliffs. They led him back to the small hut near the fire pit, where she followed carrying a bowl of water and clean cloth. That evening, as dusk settled like ash across the camp, she knelt beside him in silence. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the wound at his side. The firelight trembled across her face, gold and amber, soft against the darkness. Eli wanted to speak, to thank her, but his voice failed him. He watched the way her eyes focused on her work, unflinching. When she finally glanced at him, he thought he saw a question there. Not who he was, but why he was still alive. He didn't have an answer. Outside, the drums began again, faint, distant, echoing through the desert night. He lay back, the sound of it rising and falling like a heartbeat. That night, as sleep pulled him under, Eli Tanner understood only this. He was alive not because he deserved to be, but because one stranger had chosen mercy over fear. He closed his eyes to the sound of her voice outside the tent, speaking softly to someone unseen. The words meant nothing to him, but the tone did. It was the sound of light refusing to die, even in a land of endless dust. And somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled low, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Tone and realization, bleak yet reverent. The world remains cruel, but grace flickers at its edges. Eli realizes he has crossed more than land. He has stepped into a world where survival demands humility, and where forgiveness, once given, can cut deeper than any blade. The days blurred like brushstrokes of dust and light. The settlement woke with the same rhythm each morning. The crackle of cooking fires, the sound of water carried from the stream, the thud of pestles grinding corn against stone. Smoke rose in slow ribbons, folding into the sky like prayers. Eli watched it all from the edge of the lodge where they kept him. His body healed faster than his spirit. The broken leg mended, though it throbbed when he stood too long. The bruises faded, but not the looks. Every time he stepped outside to stretch or fetch water, he felt eyes trailing him, sharp, mistrustful, unspoken warnings. The children kept their distance. The dogs barked when he passed. The older men nodded without kindness, and even the women, who sometimes glanced toward him, did so with caution, as though kindness might be mistaken for treason. He couldn't blame them. He'd have done the same. Still, there was a strange peace in the quiet rhythm of the place. No shouting, no liquor, no gunfire, just the sound of work. Hands shaping, carving, weaving, surviving. The Apache lived with a patience he didn't understand, as if time itself moved differently here. He spent his mornings helping however he could, mending broken tools, carrying wood to the fires, tending the horses when they'd let him. The first few times the younger men shoved him away, muttering curses. But one morning, when the chief himself found Eli binding a cracked yoke with rawhide, he said nothing. Only watched. Then he gave a small nod before walking off. That nod stayed with Eli for days. At dusk, he often sat alone by the outer corral, listening to the hum of evening, the low songs sung by the women, the rustle of wind through grass. The sound reminded him of nights long ago, before the war, before everything he believed in turned to ash. He'd been a soldier once. Not proud of it, not anymore. His regiment had ridden through canyons like this one, torches in hand, chasing phantoms they called enemies. He remembered the orders shouted over rifle fire, the smell of smoke and scorched earth. The screams he couldn't forget no matter how far he rode. Now, as he watched the tribe's fires flicker under the stars, he wondered if any of the homes they'd burned had belonged to these people, if any of the faces that haunted his sleep had been theirs. Sometimes, when the night stretched long, he'd whisper to himself, God help me. I didn't know. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. One evening, as the sky bled red behind the ridges, Chief Nightshade came to him. The old man carried a walking staff carved with coyote symbols, the edges worn smooth by years of use. He stopped a few paces away and studied Eli in silence. "You heal," the chief said in slow, accented English. Eli nodded. "Thanks to your daughter." The chief's eyes flickered. Approval, maybe, or warning. "You fight?" he asked. Eli hesitated. "Not anymore." The chief gestured toward the scars on his arms. "These say you have killed." Eli stared at the ground. "Yes," the silence stretched. The wind picked up dust and carried it through the firelight like drifting ghosts. Finally, the chief asked, "Who were you before?" Eli looked up then, into eyes that had seen too much and lost too many. His mouth felt dry. "I was a man who forgot what side he was on." The words hung between them, heavy and true. The chief said nothing. He only nodded once, as if he understood more than Eli wished he did, and turned back toward the fading light. Later that night, as the camp settled into quiet, Eli noticed movement near the doorway of the lodge. A silhouette, slender, unmoving. Aiyana stood there, half lit by the fire behind her, arms wrapped around a shawl. She didn't speak, and neither did he, but her presence was not accidental. She had heard. When she stepped forward, the firelight caught the faint glimmer of the beads in her braids. Her gaze was steady, not soft, but searching. "My father says truth weighs more than lies," she said finally, her English careful, accented but clear. Eli managed a small smile. "He's right about that." She studied him for a moment longer, then asked quietly, "Why did you come here?" He thought about lying, about saying he was lost or running from outlaws. Both were true, but neither was the truth. "I came here because there was nowhere else to go," he said. "A man like me, I ran out of places that'd take me." Aiyana's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. A flicker of understanding, or maybe sorrow. "And what do you seek?" she asked. Eli looked out toward the desert, where the horizon glowed faintly from the moon. "Forgiveness, maybe, though I don't reckon I've earned it." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then she said, "Forgiveness is not given to those who seek it. It comes to those who live worthy of it." Her words cut deeper than any knife. The days that followed carried a fragile stillness between them. Aiyana would pass by his work at the corral, sometimes offering water, sometimes only silence. Once, she corrected his attempt to repair a broken pot, showing him how to mold the clay with the heel of his palm instead of his fingertips. The closeness of her hand startled him. She didn't flinch. He noticed, too, how her people respected her, not because of her birthright, but because of her calm. Even those who distrusted Eli hesitated to cross her. Her quiet authority carried the weight of something sacred. Still, her kindness drew whispers. The women watched from doorways. The young warriors frowned when she lingered too long near the outsider's tent. The air grew tense with something unsaid. Eli felt it pressing in on him, that unspoken reminder that no amount of work, no amount of silence, could ever make him one of them. He was tolerated, nothing more. And yet, when their eyes met across the firelight, something wordless passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but a fragile recognition. Two souls, both exiled from peace, finding a mirror in the other. That night, as a thin wind carried the scent of rain, Eli lay awake listening to the low hum of the camp. He thought of Aiyana's voice, the steadiness in it, the quiet authority that reminded him of someone he once loved and lost. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him. A ghost, a warning, or a man trying to crawl out from under his own sins? He didn't know. But as he drifted into uneasy sleep, he realized that silence could be its own punishment, a trial without verdict, a rope without knot, and in that silence, somewhere deep inside, something small began to shift, not forgiveness, not yet, but the faint stirring of a man remembering what it meant to be human, tone and realization, quiet introspection. The dust of old sins stirs again, Aiyana begins to feel the ache of understanding, that empathy cuts deeper than hate. Eli begins to see that silence is not mercy, but the first step toward truth. The wind came first, low, moaning through the canyons like a wounded thing. The sky bruised itself to the color of iron. By mid-afternoon, the light dimmed as if someone had drawn a curtain across the sun. The people of the camp began to move with purpose. Women hurried to gather baskets and cover food. Men tied the horses, reinforced the shelters, and brought the children inside. The smell of rain hung heavy in the air, raw and electric. Eli Tanner had seen storms like this on the open plains before, but never in the valley. The mountains trapped the clouds and turned them wild. The wind picked up in fierce bursts, tearing at his coat and filling his mouth with dust. He looked toward the horizon and saw the black belly of the storm rolling closer, thunder rumbling deep in its gut. The first drops hit the ground like stones. By the time the rain came full, it was a living thing, a roar that swallowed the camp whole. The huts shuddered, the fires hissed and died, and the air filled with the crack and snap of wood giving way. Water ran through the dirt paths like rivers. Eli didn't think. He moved. He ran into the open, half-blind with rain, shouting over the wind. One of the horse enclosures had broken. The animals were panicking, their hooves churning mud into a frenzy. He grabbed a rope, his bad leg screaming in protest, and fought to pull the post upright. Aiyana appeared beside him out of the blur, soaked to the skin, her shawl plastered to her shoulders. She was trying to lead 2 horses back toward higher ground, her hair whipping across her face. For a moment their eyes met, lightning flashing white between them. No words were needed. Together they worked, her steady, him stubborn. He lashed the rope to the fence post. She soothed the horses with words he couldn't understand, but somehow felt. The storm swallowed their voices, their breath, everything but the work. Rain stung his face, mixed with blood from where a flying splinter had cut his cheek. His hands, still raw from old wounds, tore open again on the rope, but he didn't stop. Not until the last of the animals was secured and the shelter walls held firm. By then, both of them were shaking, from cold, from exhaustion, from something deeper neither could name. A bolt of lightning split the sky so close the ground seemed to tremble. Eli turned just in time to see the sacred totem, a tall cedar pole carved with symbols and feathers, burst into flame where it stood near the chief's lodge. The strike was blinding. Sparks flew, carried by wind and rain. The fire burned fast, a white-hot blaze against the dark storm. People screamed, rushing forward with buckets, hides, anything to smother it. But the rain couldn't douse it quickly enough. Within moments, the totem, the heart of their spiritual ground, collapsed in a hiss of steam and smoke. The camp went silent, except for the rain. Then came the shouting. Old women wailed. Men pointed toward Eli. One shouted words that needed no translation. "White man curse!" He stood frozen, rain dripping from his hair, breath ragged. The accusation struck like another bolt of lightning, raw and absolute. The chief emerged from his lodge, his face unreadable, his daughter beside him. The elders gathered, their expressions hardened with fear and fury. The burned totem crackled in the mud behind them, a ghost of its former self. Voices rose, overlapping, some calling for his death, others demanding he be driven out before more misfortune came. Eli didn't fight when 2 warriors grabbed him by the arms and dragged him forward through the storm. His body ached, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the thunder, the flame, the look of betrayal in their eyes. He thought of running. He thought of speaking, but neither would matter. To them, the storm was judgment, and he was its messenger. They threw him to his knees in front of the chief. The rain washed streaks of mud down his face. He raised his eyes, searching Nietzsche's expression for anything, understanding, pity, even hatred. Nothing. The chief spoke in short, heavy bursts of his native tongue. Eli couldn't follow the words, but he felt their weight. A verdict being shaped, a life measured, and then, from behind the circle, came a voice. "Aiyana!" She pushed through the gathered crowd. Her shawl torn, her hair soaked and clinging to her cheeks. Her breath came fast, her eyes fierce. She didn't look at her father first. She looked at Eli. He couldn't tell if it was anger or fear in her gaze, only that it held both life and defiance. She spoke quickly, her voice trembling at first, then steadying. The others shouted over her, but she didn't stop. She turned to her father, and the tone changed. Lower, pleading but firm. The crowd fell quiet enough for the rain to fill the silence again. Finally, she said it in English, her voice cutting through the storm. Let the storm pass first. 4 words. Simple, steady. But they struck like thunder. The chief said nothing. His eyes moved from her to the burned totem, then to the man kneeling before him. One of the elders protested, his voice high with rage. The chief silenced him with a raised hand. The rain began to ease, falling in softer waves now, the thunder retreating into the distance. The air still smelled of smoke and fear, but something in it had shifted. The chief looked at his daughter, then at the sky, then back at Eli. Finally, he gave a single nod. Tomorrow, he said in English, so slow it sounded carved in stone. We decide tomorrow. They pulled Eli to his feet, bound his hands loosely, and led him to the same lodge he'd slept in since his arrival. Aiyana followed, saying nothing. When they reached the doorway, she handed him a small blanket and whispered something he didn't catch. Her voice trembled as if the words cost her. He wanted to thank her, to ask why she'd spoken for him, but the look in her eyes stopped him. Outside, the rain lightened to a mist. Smoke from the burned totem mixed with the scent of wet cedar. The tribe worked quietly to repair what they could. Eli sat by the dying fire inside, listening to the storm move east across the valley. Every rumble of thunder felt like a heartbeat inside his chest. He thought of her words. Let the storm pass first. Maybe she hadn't been speaking only of the weather. That night, for the first time since he'd arrived, Eli didn't dream of fire and gunfire and guilt. He dreamed instead of rain falling on open land, washing the world clean. Tone and realization. Tension hums like thunder, alive, dangerous, purifying. Both Eli and Aiyana glimpsed the fragile line between mercy and judgment. The storm outside mirrors the one within, violent, cleansing, and necessary. The storm left behind a world that smelled of ash and renewal. The ground steamed where the rain had soaked into scorched soil. Trees dripped quietly, their branches heavy. The air felt wrung out, emptied of everything but the ache of what had just passed. The tribe moved through the wreckage in silence, repairing, sweeping, mending. But though the storm had broken, its tension lingered like thunder rolling somewhere far away. Eli Tanner sat outside the healer's hut, wrists still loosely bound, staring at the horizon. His hands were torn and swollen from the work, his face hollowed by sleepless nights. He didn't ask what the council's decision might be. He already knew the weight of waiting. When Aiyana came to him, she carried no weapon, only a quiet authority that made the guards step back. My father says you stay in the winter lodge, she said. Until the council meets. Eli nodded, not trusting his voice. The wind carried the scent of cedar and smoke as they walked together toward the edge of camp, where an old lodge leaned against the rise of the valley wall. The winter lodge was older than the others, built by Aiyana's grandfather. Its timbers darkened by years of firelight and story. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp hides, and the faint sweetness of herbs hung from the rafters. Aiyana pushed the flap aside and motioned for him to enter. It keeps out the wind, she said softly. Mostly. He stepped inside, ducking beneath the low doorway. Shadows gathered in the corners, and the sound of rain still whispered faintly against the roof. A small fire burned at the center, the smoke slipping through a narrow vent in the ceiling. This where your father stayed? He asked after a while. She nodded. In the cold months. After my brother died, he didn't speak for a whole winter. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was alive, breathing between them. He watched her move about the room, her hands practiced as she tended the fire, adjusted blankets, and set a clay bowl of water near the hearth. Why me? He asked finally. Why did you speak for me? Aiyana didn't look up. Because the storm was not your doing. That's not what your people think. No, she said, voice calm but tired. But storms do not ask permission before they destroy. They come because they must, he didn't argue. He just watched the flames flicker, throwing soft light across her face. Days passed like that, slow, heavy, half-lived. The tribe brought food in silence, left it by the door, and left again without meeting Eli's eyes. He could feel their judgment in every footstep outside, every hushed word. Inside, the world had shrunk to 4 walls and one constant presence, Aiyana. She didn't guard him with threats. She watched with stillness, the kind that made him feel both seen and stripped bare. They spoke only when the wind rose, when the night felt too big for silence. One night he asked, "Did you ever go east?" "Beyond the plains?" She smiled faintly. "Once, when I was a child. My brother took me to see the railroad. It sounded like thunder that never stopped." He nodded. "I helped build that line once. Thought it was progress. Thought it'd make something better out of the dust." Her eyes lifted to his. "Did it?" He hesitated. "No, it just brought men like me further west, and took more than it gave." Aiyana looked back into the fire. "My brother was killed near that railroad." The words hung in the air like embers that refused to fall. Eli's throat tightened. "I'm sorry. He was shot," she continued quietly, "by men in blue coats. They said he was a thief. He had stolen nothing." Eli turned away, jaw hardening. "Blue coats," he whispered. "I wore one once." "I know." He looked at her sharply, but she wasn't accusing him. She was simply stating a fact, as though she'd already made peace with it. "I was 24, he said. "Thought I was fighting for something good. I didn't understand what I was burning until it was already gone." She studied him then, not like a prisoner, but like a man being measured against the truth. "And your family?" He stared at the fire until its glow blurred. "I had a wife. She waited for me. When I came home, I found her grave before I found her house. Fever took her while I was out fighting someone else's war." Aiyana said nothing. She only moved closer to the fire, feeding it another log. The light flared between them, painting the air in orange and gold. After a long time, she spoke again, her voice quiet as rain on cedar. "Maybe war takes the same from everyone, no matter which side they stand on." He nodded. "Maybe it does." The nights grew colder. The roof creaked under wind, the fire burned low, and the line between watcher and watched began to blur. They didn't touch, not even once, but there was a gravity between them. Not passion, not yet, but something deeper. Forgiveness, fragile and unfamiliar. She listened when he dreamed aloud, of plains turning green again, of horses running free without riders. He listened when she sang low songs in her language, songs that sounded older than the land itself. Outside, whispers spread. Warriors murmured that the chief's daughter had lost her sense, that her heart had softened toward the enemy. Others said the storm had changed her, that she was bewitched. Eli heard the words through the thin walls at night, the voices curling through the smoke hole like ghosts. He never told her. She didn't need to know. She already felt it, the pressure, the watching eyes. Yet she stayed. When he thanked her one night, she shook her head. "Do not thank me, Eli Tanner. If the council spares you, it will not be because I asked. It will be because you gave them reason." He met her gaze across the dim firelight. "And if they don't?" "Then you will meet your death as a man who tried to make something right," she said. "And I will not be ashamed to have kept watch." The fire crackled. The air between them warmed and trembled. The storm outside had long passed, but inside that small cedar lodge, another kind of weather gathered, quieter, more dangerous. They both felt it. The fragile pulse of trust, the first warmth of forgiveness. The dawning truth that to see one's enemy as human is to risk breaking open one's own heart. Tone and realization. Slow, intimate, dangerous. The fire between them glows, not passion yet, but forgiveness taking shape. They both realize that healing requires the courage to see the human in one's enemy. The night was thick with stillness, the kind that comes before something breaks. The rain had stopped days ago, but the ground still smelled of wet earth and smoke. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the black horizon. Inside the winter lodge, the fire burned low, painting the walls in trembling gold. Eli Tanner couldn't sleep. He sat awake against the wall, listening to the faint breathing of the camp, The soft shuffle of guards, the crackle of embers. He had learned to read silence as easily as men once read the sky. This silence, he knew, was wrong. Too heavy, too held. Then he heard it. The sound of a horse snorting, then a muffled cry. Another, the quick snap of leather reins. Shadows moved beyond the lodge flap. Instinct cut through the haze of exhaustion. He reached for the rifle that lay by the fire, a weapon the tribe had allowed him only for hunting under watch. He didn't think. He moved. When the first shot cracked, the camp awoke as one. Children screamed. Men rushed from their huts. Torches flared to life, streaking the dark with yellow fire. Outlaws, a dozen or more, stormed through the edge of camp, faces wrapped in cloth, rifles flashing. They fired wildly, spooking the horses, shouting to drive them toward the ravine. It wasn't war, it was theft, but blood comes easy in the dark. Eli burst through the lodge door barefoot, the cold biting into his skin. "Riders," he shouted, though few understood the words. His voice was enough. Aiyana appeared from the shadows, bow in hand, eyes burning. "They're taking the herd," she cried in her tongue. He turned toward the corral, saw the shapes of men driving the tribe's horses into the open. He didn't hesitate. He ran. Bullets hissed past. He dropped behind a water trough, returning fire.
One outlaw fell, another's horse reared.
The night exploded into chaos. Firelight, thunder, hooves. Aiyana's younger sister, Kiona, darted into the open, chasing after a terrified colt tangled in its tether. A shot cracked near her. She froze. Eli didn't think. He ran straight into the line of fire, grabbed her by the arm, and threw her down behind a cart just as a bullet tore through his shoulder. The impact spun him sideways. He hit the ground hard, choking on mud and smoke. Somewhere behind him, the chief's war cry split the night. Warriors swarmed from the shadows, their arrows cutting through the last of the outlaws. Within minutes, the thieves broke, fleeing into the darkness, leaving their dead behind. The horses still wild, but safe. The fight was over as suddenly as it began. Eli lay in the mud, staring up at a sky washed pale with the first light of dawn. He tried to sit, but pain pressed him back down. The world swam, smoke, faces, whispers. Aiyana knelt beside him, her hands slick with his blood. "Stay still," she said, voice trembling. "You'll tear it worse," he managed a faint smile. "Looks like I earned my keep." Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. "You fool," she whispered. "You should have stayed inside." He coughed, a weak laugh. "Never been good at staying inside." The world dimmed around the edges. He saw the firelight reflected in her eyes before the blackness took him. When Eli woke, the world was hushed. His shoulder burned, bandaged in clean linen. Smoke drifted lazily through the open flap of the lodge. He heard murmurs outside, dozens of voices, low, uncertain. He tried to rise, but Aiyana pushed him gently back down. "Don't," she said. "They're gathering. For what?" She didn't answer. The look in her eyes was enough. Judgment. Again. He nodded weakly. "Then I should stand." She hesitated, then helped him to his feet. He swayed but stayed upright. The world beyond the lodge was bright with morning. The storm was gone, but its mark remained. Torn fences, muddy tracks, blood in the dirt. The tribe had gathered in a wide circle before the chief's platform. Warriors, mothers, elders, children, all silent, their faces carved from stone. The outlaws' bodies had been burned before sunrise. Only the smell of smoke lingered. Chief Nietzsche stood at the center, tall and unmoving. His gaze met Eli's, unreadable. Eli walked forward slowly, every step sending pain down his arm. When he reached the circle, he knelt, not out of obedience, but out of honesty, because he no longer had the strength to stand proud. He spoke with effort. "Your people live. Your horses too. That's enough for me." The chief's eyes narrowed. He said something in Apache, low and measured. One of the elders translated. "He asks, why?" Eli lifted his head. "Because once I didn't protect what was right. I won't make that mistake again." The words fell into the dust like seeds that might or might not take root. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces softened, others hardened further. The chief raised his hand, slow, deliberate. The gesture was unmistakable. Judgment. Eli closed his eyes. A strange calm settled over him. Not peace exactly, but surrender. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. If death was the price for one moment of decency, he'd pay it. Then a voice broke the silence. Aiyana stepped forward, bareheaded, hair loose in the wind. She walked between the warriors, her steps sure and unhurried. When she reached her father, she looked him in the eye. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. He fought for us. 4 words, simple, clear, and final. The air changed. It was as if the earth itself paused to listen. The chief's hand froze mid-air. No one moved. The only sound was the wind sliding through the pines and the low cry of a hawk circling above. Eli lifted his gaze to her, confusion and awe mingling in his expression. The firelight from a nearby brazier caught her face, proud, defiant, tear-streaked. Her father looked at her for a long time. What passed between them was older than language, the silent understanding that the world would never be the same after those words. Finally, the chief lowered his hand. No one spoke. Judgment dissolved into stillness. The tribe began to disperse slowly, murmuring prayers under their breath. Eli remained kneeling, blood drying on his arm, eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't know whether he'd been spared or simply postponed. But it didn't matter. Aiyana stood beside him, her shadow falling across his. "Rest," she said quietly. "You've done enough." He looked up at her, the woman who had once been his jailer, now his witness, and for the first time since he'd crossed that desert, he felt something like grace, tone and realization, redemptive, sacred, trembling with relief. Eli realizes he's finally done one thing worth dying for. Aiyana realizes love can be both rebellion and prayer. The desert was changing. Where once the earth had cracked beneath frost and storm, now shoots of pale grass pushed through the clay. The mornings were gentler, not warm yet, but no longer cruel. Smoke from cook fires drifted low across the camp, carrying the scent of mesquite and damp soil. Weeks had passed since the night of the attack. Eli Tanner's wounds had begun to knit, though the scar in his shoulder still burned when he moved too fast. He'd taken to walking the edge of the camp each day, silent, steady, the limp in his gait now a familiar rhythm. The children no longer hid when they saw him. Some even followed at a distance, whispering, daring each other to get close. He nodded to them sometimes, but rarely spoke. He'd learned that words had weight here, and silence, more meaning still. Aiyana visited less often, though he felt her presence everywhere, in the way his bandages were replaced before dawn, in the extra portion of coffee left by his fire, in the faint traces of sage that clung to the lodge. He never asked, and she never said. Some bonds didn't need naming. The council never spoke of judgment again. The chief had declared the matter ended, though no one said whether that meant forgiveness or simply forgetting. Either way, Eli was allowed to stay until the thaw, a guest of uncertain status, watched, but unshackled. He tried to make himself useful. He helped repair fences, carried water, split logs, and tended horses. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a prayer, an offering to something unseen. The tribe's men no longer turned away when he passed. One of the elders even nodded once, brief and almost grudging, a gesture that here was as good as a handshake. At night, when the sky turned the color of spilled ink and the stars stretched endless above, Eli would sit outside the lodge, nursing the ache in his arm, listening to the drums from distant fires. Sometimes Aiyana would be there, her shawl wrapped tight, her face half lit by flame. They didn't speak much. Words weren't needed between those who had already spoken with their actions. One evening the chief came to him. The old man stood tall despite the years, his shadow long in the firelight. In his hands he carried a small pouch made of deerskin and a carved pipe, worn smooth with use. He set them down beside Eli. "Tobacco," he said in halting English. "A gift. For the road." Eli looked up, startled. "The road?" The chief nodded once. "Snow melts. You heal. It is time." The words landed softly, but they carried finality. Eli swallowed hard. "And if I stay?" The chief's eyes narrowed, not unkindly. "Then you stay as what?" Eli had no answer. He looked at the fire. Instead, at the way it bent and flickered, never still, never belonging to the wood it consumed. After a moment he nodded. "Then I'll ride when the sun rises." The chief gave a slow, approving nod. "Horse waits, not gift, not debt, only road beneath you." When the old man left, Eli sat alone beside the fire for a long time. The tobacco pouch lay in his hand, its scent rich and clean, the smell of the land itself. He thought of the months behind him, the blood, the silence, the faces that had turned from hatred to wary respect. He'd come here a fugitive. He'd leave a man. That was enough. At dawn, the camp was washed in gold. Mist rose from the valley like breath from sleeping horses. Eli stood at the edge of the corral, tightening the saddle cinch on the bay mare the chief had chosen for him. Strong, scarred, sure-footed. A mirror, he thought, of himself. Aiyana waited near the fire pit, her shawl drawn close. She didn't move as he approached, only watched him with that calm, unblinking gaze that had unsettled him from the very first day. "You're leaving," she said, not as a question. He nodded. "Your father says it's time." She looked away toward the horizon, where the sun was lifting its first blade of light over the mesas. "It's a long road." "I've ridden longer," he said, "but never after something worth leaving." Her lips curved. Not a smile, not quite. "You talk like a man who's found peace." He shrugged lightly. Maybe just found a reason not to keep running. For a long moment they said nothing. The wind lifted the edge of her shawl, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. Somewhere nearby a horse stamped, impatient to move. He took a breath. "Aiyana, there's not much I can give. But if you ever—" She cut him off gently. "You already gave it." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Her eyes met his, steady, bright as the morning. "You gave my people a reason to remember mercy." He didn't answer. He couldn't. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint scar near her temple, the soft streak of dust on her cheek. "Go," she said softly, "before you find a reason to stay." He laughed once, low and rough. "You always did know when to end a fight." "This isn't an ending," she said. "It's just the part where we ride different directions." He nodded, jaw tight. Then, without a word, he swung into the saddle. The mare shifted beneath him, hooves stirring the dust. The camp had gathered quietly behind her, men, women, children, all watching. No one spoke. Aiyana took a step back, the dawn light behind her turning her shawl into a flag of color, red, gold, and gray. Eli tipped his hat, the brim low, and turned the mare toward the open desert. He rode slow at first, then faster as the wind rose, the camp shrinking behind him. The world opened wide, miles of light and dust, mountains ghosting on the horizon. The rhythm of the horse beneath him felt like a heartbeat, steady and alive. Halfway across the valley, he reined in and looked back. The camp was a small cluster of smoke and color against the pale land. And there, at the edge, standing apart, was her silhouette. For a moment, the rising sun caught her shawl, and she seemed made of light. He sat there a long time, letting the wind carry the silence between them. No words, no promises. Just the quiet understanding of two souls who had crossed paths long enough to change each other. Then he turned the horse toward the west. Dust rose behind him, curling like memory, like forgiveness itself. The land stretched ahead, endless and waiting. Eli Tanner rode on, a man not redeemed by belonging, but by the courage to keep going. Tone and realization, bittersweet peace. Eli has found dignity again. Aiyana has found her voice. The story closes on silence and wind, the sound of a soul unburdened.